The Archdiocese of Chicago is a vibrant and diverse faith community. We celebrate our faith through worship, evangelization, and reaching out to the needy. Welcome to Catholic Chicago.
And welcome to Catholic Chicago on WNDZ 750 AM. You can also get us on youtube.com/Catholic Chicago, youtube.com/Catholic Chicago. We are airing this on the day after Easter, April 1, so happy April Fool's Day to everybody. Easter celebrated yesterday. We have taped this on Monday, March 25th of Holy Week, and play back a week later. So hope you all had a very blessed Easter, Holy Week and Easter. And with that, I'm Father Greg Sakowicz, rector of the Cathedral, and again, co-host Mark Teresi from the Cathedral, working on our 170th anniversary. Mark, take it away for part 2 of the program.
Sure. ACTA Publications began in 1957 as publisher of books and audio, video resources for religious education and spiritual development. It has since broadened its editorial scope to include sports, social justice, community organizing, caregiving, grief, and mourning, storytelling and novels, and children's books. They publish 8 to 10 new titles per year and have a backlist of over 400 books and CDs. ACTA titles are non-academic, and they're aimed at us, the average reader. Most of ACTA's titles are meant to be given as gifts, both on special occasions or to people who are going through specific life situations or stages. In fact, I gave a gift of the beautiful garden book to Father Tone at Holy Name. Beautiful book. Joining us this morning is the president and publisher of ACTA Publications, Greg Pierce. And for this segment, we also have author Charles Chuck Shanabruch, author of the book titled Ed Marciniak's City and Church, A Voice of Conscience. Welcome to Catholic Chicago.
Good morning once again to Greg and Charles. Welcome to the program, Chuck. And now,
good morning,
Chuck. Where are you from?
I've lived in Chicago for the last 50 years, but I'm originally from Ohio. So.
And where do you live in Chicago? In the city or in the suburbs?
I lived in the Beverly neighborhood for about 40 years. I now live in Downers Grove.
Okay, but you are an Ohio boy growing up.
Yes.
Are you a big Cleveland Browns fan or Cincinnati Bengals?
I was, but not now.
When you were growing up, you were. And of course, Greg Pierce, I've known the Pierce family for 32 years from St. Mary of the Woods. And Greg, you've done so much for the church in Chicago and for the community of St. Mary of the Woods. And found out from you earlier that your wife, Kathy, is still teaching part-time at St. Mary of the Woods Grammar School. And she was and is an outstanding teacher. So this book you've now written, Chuck, Ed Marciniak's City and Church, A Voice of Conscience. How did you go about writing the book? What was the background for this?
I was looking for a my background was I had a PhD in history, and I was looking for a project, and I somebody mentioned maybe I should look at Ed Marciniak. And I had met Ed a couple of times, but I didn't know that much about him. And I began to do some research, and I was blown away by his life and what he had done. And the Archdiocese of Chicago has an archives, and there were 27 boxes of his papers that hadn't been cataloged. And I started to read, and after the first or second book, I just said, this man's life is amazing, what he's done for the city and for the church. So I just started writing a biography.
What intrigued you about those archives?
Well, I mean, the archive, they were just his papers, and I'd used the archives before when I wrote my dissertation about immigrants in Chicago, but it was much more. I had much more access to things there, and it was just the wealth of information there was incredible, and the friendliness and the support of the staff.
Now, along those lines, Greg, what prompted you? I know the answer, but our readers or listeners don't. What prompted you to take the work of Chuck and turn this into a book?
Well, first of all, I want to say that I love the fact that you paired this with the previous section, because that was a history book or storybook about the Universal Church. This is very much about the Chicago Church.
Mm-hmm.
And Ed was, the reason I published it when Chuck brought it to me is two reasons. One is Ed is a really important lay person. He was my mentor in being a lay person. He felt that the lay person had a vocation, that the lay person had a role in the church and in the world. So that's how the title came about, Ed Marciniak's City and Church, because he straddled both. The other thing is, you know, it was a good book. It has more footnotes in it than any book I've ever published, probably all the books I've ever published, because Chuck is a very good scholar, and he was going to document every single thing he said in the book, but he also did it in a way that's a great story. It starts out with Ed and his wife at a big thing near the end of their lives when they are celebrated. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit, Chuck, as a way of how you got into the book.
When I started reading about it, I knew very little about him, and one of the first things I came across were a couple newspaper articles about this salute to Ed Marciniak. I thought, well, that's interesting, and it was an amazing event that was co-hosted. The chairs were Mayor Daley and Cardinal Bernardin. I thought, well, this guy's connected, and so it was a perfect. But that was his whole life, as Greg said, he was in both worlds, and he was. But he did so much. But yet he was a controversial person. The urban affairs editor for the Tribune, who got a Pulitzer, John McCarran, said he was remarkable, but he was also a pain in the butt. And so he was just down to earth, real. But 800 people came, and they came to support his life and what he had done, and join him in a new venture to try to improve education in Chicago. He never ceased being involved.
Ed, Greg, would I be right in saying that Ed Marciniak was and is one of your heroes?
Well, I never used the word heroes. I used the word mentor. Because Ed was the kind of guy that if he got somebody that was interesting or interested in what he was interested in, he would not let you go. You know, he just kind of got his claws into you, and he was going to teach you everything he knew, which he did. That's why he had 26 boxes of things in his archives, because he saved everything. And every once a month or so, he would send me a specific article, because he had like 50 or 100 periodicals that he subscribed to from all over the world.
Wow.
And then he would pick one article and he'd say, Greg Pierce needs to read this. And he would send it to me. Dad was the founder, along with his brother-in-law, Russell Barta, of the National Center for the Laity, which is an organization that was formed in 1978 here in Chicago to encourage the support for the laity's role, not in the church as much as in the world. And so all the stuff that I learned about the laity's role in the world and the spirituality of work came from Ed and Russ Barta.
Now, it's interesting because I have a Ed Marciniak story. Father Sebastian Lewis was at St. Joe's on Orleans, and Ed went worship there, and Father Sebastian asked me to do music for a Saturday afternoon mass. He wanted anybody in the area, the street folks, to worship together with that community. And Ed was a big proponent of the idea of all of us worshiping together. And we had some wonderful conversations. Where does liturgy gathering fit in to the Ed Marciniak City and Church book?
I don't write much about liturgy, but liturgy was essential to Ed, and he said that at different times. But I focused on his Catholic social action, but that was really the ground on which he stood. He just felt that we were all called to liturgy, but the important thing was at the end of the liturgy we were all sent out to make a difference in the world by making it a better place. But liturgy was central. Very much.
Along those lines, go ahead, Chuck.
Well, I was just going to say he was always involved. He was the lector at the parish, and his wife sang at the parish at St. Edith's, and then wherever he went, he was just, the liturgy was so really important to him, though. Yeah.
Now, along those lines, both a question for Chuck and for Greg. If you take the title of the book, Ed Marciniak's City and Church, A Voice of Conscience, in your words, Chuck, how was Ed Marciniak the voice of conscience for city and church in Chicago, to be answered by both Chuck and Greg?
I'll just begin. Ed's voice was most often heard, in hallways and in rooms, gathering people together to share ideas about what needed to be done. But he did it in another way, and that was with his typewriter. He had an old Smith Corona, and he pounded out article after article. He edited, 3 different papers. For 3 years, he edited the Chicago Catholic Worker, and for about 17 years, he edited a paper called Work, which was for the Catholic Labor Alliance, which really dealt with the issues of economic justice. But in those two, and also a publication called New City Journal in the 60s, even when he worked at the city of Chicago, he was on the managing board and he wrote for it. He was always taking on positions that challenged people to rethink how they approached their responsibility to do, as he always said, what would Christ do in this situation? And he trusted lay people to be the ones to answer that, motivated by an understanding of the Beatitudes.
How about for you, Greg?
So I'm thinking of the word holy. And I believe that the root of the word holy, H-O-L-Y, is also the same as the word holy, W-H-O-L-Y, holy, to be whole. And that's what strikes me about as I'm thinking about him right now, is that he was the same person in every aspect of his life. So that's why he was in both city and church. Every aspect of his life was a whole. It was something he thought about the same way all the time. Two of my favorite Ed quotes is, one is he said, "There's nobody more poor than a person who thinks they don't have a vocation." And the other one was, and this was, he had a wonderful wife and family. That's one of the reasons he was so important, because they worked together as a team. And I think there were 3 girls, and who are still around here, and hope they listen to the show. And but one of the things he said to me once, he said a liberal. He said a liberal is a conservative whose whose daughter has just applied for a job.
Now give those 2 quotes again. Those are 2 great quotes. One more time, Greg.
All right. So the first one was about all of us, because a lot of the problem that lay people have with the church is we think it's for the clergy, that the clergy have a vocation and the rest of us don't. But Ed was absolutely convinced that every person, especially if you were Christian or Catholic, that you had a vocation to do something very specific, which was go make the world more like the way God would have it, or what Jesus called the kingdom of God. So so when he went to work for the city as the head of, Chuck can give all his credentials, but I mean, he worked for the city, worked for Daily. He was criticized for working for Daily. He was criticized for working with the Catholic Worker. He was criticized for being anti-war in Vietnam. He was always the same person. So the first quote, nobody is as poor as somebody who thinks they don't have a vocation. Thinks they don't have a vocation. They do have one. Thinks they don't. And secondly, he said a liberal is a conservative whose daughter has applied for her first job, because this was back when women weren't being hired, and Ed did something about that. He didn't just talk about it. He went out and did something about it.
Beautiful. On that note, we're going to take a little break. WNDZ, 7:50 a.m., Catholic Chicago. You can go to youtube.com/Catholic Chicago. We're with Chuck Shanabruch, Greg Pierce, Ed Marciniak, City and Church, A Voice of Conscience. We will be back in a few minutes. Please stay tuned.
Did you know that Catholic Charities accepts car donations? If you're ready to free up space in your garage and put a stop to all those expenses that go along with owning a car, we will gratefully accept your donation, whether the car is running or not. You choose a pickup time that is convenient for you, and we will make the donation as easy as possible free of charge. You'll receive a charitable donation receipt as well. We accept all types of vehicles nationwide, and you will know that your donation is made to Catholic Charities, an agency you can trust. To learn more about donating your car, call 877-786-4483. That's 877-786-4483. Thank you.
People always say, how can you spend your day with 3-year-olds? Seeing the changes that they go through and just the journey and how they grow, this is a very rewarding job. Even though at the end of the day, we're not the highest paid people on earth. And when I have a parent contact me and say, my child loves school, that to me, I'm setting that foundation for their love of learning. Because really, you are changing lives, you are molding lives.
Shape the next generation of leaders. Teach. Apply today at artchicago.org/schooljobs.
We're back, WNDZ, 750 AM, Catholic Chicago. You can go to youtube.com. We're with Greg Pierce and we're with Chuck Shanabruch, the author of Ed Marciniak, City and Church, A Voice of Conscience. Father Greg, you have a question.
Yeah, this has been a fascinating discussion with Chuck and with Greg. Chuck, the question I have for you is, when you say that Ed Marciniak was a voice of conscience, we've certainly rubbed people the wrong way, or he could be in their face, because he was very stick-to-itiveness, he wouldn't back down. How did the Church of Chicago hierarchy respond to Ed Marciniak?
Good question.
I think he got along with. There were people he was very close to, but he managed to work with people by trying to work through other people who had influence. So, for example, when he set up a couple different things, he did it in conjunction with clergy, and his best friend was Father Dan Cantwell, later Monsignor Dan Cantwell. And so when he worked to set up the Chicago interracial council. He and Dan would go out to parishes and say, look, you've got to integrate your school. There are people here who have complained, and they'd say that. But he'd he'd always go with Dan, and he'd never back down for what he did. And the same with workers' rights. And he got along with some bishops, archbishops, I think maybe a bit better than others, because he thought they were more proactive. He really admired Cardinal Meyer and Cardinal Bernardin, and I know he worked close with Bernardin. There's a lot of correspondence back and forth with that, and Bernardin thanks him so much for his being involved with emphasizing the role of the laity in the church.
What about the Cardinal Cody? What about the Cardinal Cody years?
There isn't that much there. That he didn't have that much direct contact with them, although he worked with them when he was director of the Chicago Committee, the Chicago Commission on Human Rights, and worked to try to end the violence in the city, and there was this what they called the summit, and at that meeting was Cardinal Cody, along with Martin Luther King, Reverend King, and about 70 other people with the mayor, trying to hammer out a way to move forward peacefully and ensure the end of, a dual housing market. But Cody was there. Cody was, he got along with, but he knew he wasn't close to him, I don't think.
Greg, so you had talked about Ed Marciniak being a mentor of yours. What do you carry from Ed as you mentor your folks that are under your tutelage?
It's funny because I do view that's part of my role now that I'm kind of semi-retired, which Kathy says, my wife says, it means that I went from 2 full-time jobs to 1 full-time job. But I'd always make time to mentor young people the way Ed made time to mentor me and other people. And it's not telling them what to do. It's just being there and trying to make them identify what it is that they want to do or change about themselves so that they can do what they want to do in the world. That's what Ed taught me. I want to read one little thing from the book. Right at the very beginning at this gala that they had for Ed, Monsignor Cantwell started it off by asking how many of the 600 guests considered themselves close to Ed. To no one's surprise, a sea of waving hands shot up. Next, Cantwell asked how many found it easy to work with Ed. That drew only a few hands, but a room full of laughter. So Ed was an agitator. He was always pushing everybody, including himself, and that's what I liked about him, and that's what I tried to model my own life on him as well.
Now, along those lines, Greg, would you say the key for Ed Marciniak was relationship building?
But it wasn't like he wasn't everybody's friend. That's the point. He wasn't Daley's friend. He wasn't Cody's friend. He wasn't a lot of people's friends. I'm not even sure he was my friend. But he cared about me, and he would push me and, try to be helpful or, be the best person that I could be. And that's what I think the Catholic Church should be doing to all lay people. Not so much, trying to get us more pious, but more effective out in our daily work, with our families, in our communities. That's what I learned from Ed.
And there was a wisdom in him partnering with Monsignor Dan Cantwell. I was at Old St. Pat's when Jack Wall took over, and Dan Cantwell was as challenging from the pulpit and as gentle as he could be. And Ed probably, hopefully, picked up some of that. What did you, Chuck? Did you explore any of that relationship with Monsignor? That quote was excellent. It just seems like Dan probably filled in some of the blanks in Ed's personality.
Well, he did. He made connections, and Ed said about Cantwell and the clergy said, because they set up these organizations, the interracial council, the Catholic family movement. So many of these things came from the laity, but they always had somebody like Cantwell or Jack Egan that ran interference, and the bishop. He said the bishops could, take credit for all the good stuff that happened, but if they went too far or they rubbed people the wrong way, they could have some distance from the friction. But Cantwell, was really a great friend of Ed's. Ed was at Quigley Seminary his freshman year when Cantwell was a senior, so they knew each other. Wow. And but Ed decided to leave. But I just went back to what Greg was talking about, agitator. I read Ed's notes from when he was in his very early 20s, and he talked about, because he didn't go on to Mundelein, he went to Loyola, but he said he talked about the experience of making, what he was going to do with his life, and he finally decided that he wasn't going to go on to the clergy, but he said, quote, once the decision to be a crusader was definite, I liked the word agitator better. I had to make a decision as to whether I had a vocation to the religious or the priestly state of life. And then he went on to say, I was going to be a lay agitator, God willing. I wanted to give my body, my mind, my heart to whatever cause Christ's revolution demanded. I made no definite plans for the future. How could I? My job was to do whatever came along. So that explains Ed's involvement with so many things, but always asking people to rethink, why.
That
What
is
would Christ-
fascinating. And the thing is, did Ed spend all 5 years at Quigley, not go on to Mundelein? Did he graduate from Quigley?
He spent all 5 years there, and when he didn't go to Mundelein, there was a quote. I found a quote where he was giving an interview. He said, Marcinkus said, "Where is that Marciniak person?" Because they were supposed to be rooming next to each other because their names began with M. But no, Ed didn't go. But he was so close to so many of the priests because he knew them and they knew him as a very sincere person.
Along those lines, in writing the book, Chuck, what was the greatest insight you came to at the end of all your findings? What did you walk away with that you didn't know before? Thought, wow, what an aspect of Ed's life I didn't know about?
There was just this wholeness to his life. There were two things that stood out. His because it's Chicago and race is a dominant thing. But he one of the things he said was, if charity is the bond that unites Christians, then racial injustice and hatred are the greatest evil. And he devoted so much of his time to dealing with that. And even in terms of public housing and all those things, he just wanted things to be better. And the other was I found it. He said the noblest function of the Christian in the world is not only to protest human wretchedness, but also to alleviate it. And there he was. He was in the trenches, influencing public policy, influencing unions, fighting for justice, economic justice, laborers, but fair housing, all these things. He was just a passionate Christian.
Greg, last question I have is, did you ever imagine in your wildest dreams that you would be publishing a book on your mentor?
Actually, no, I never did. And this came 30 years after Ed died. So this isn't, like right after he died. He's not really a famous guy,
Right.
The thing I learned about him, I didn't know this, he was a big protege of Dorothy Day.
Yeah.
Right, that would make sense. Now, Greg, in just the last few seconds, Ed Marciniak's City and Church, A Voice of Conscience. Again, ACTA Publications. Give us the phone number to call you directly for the Chicago discount.
Okay, for Chicago Catholic Chicago radio program discount.
Yes.
It is 800-397-2282, and I will answer the phone. 800-397-2282.
Want to thank in a very special way for this last half hour, Chuck, Shanabruch, and Greg Pierce. Tremendous half hour.
Yes.
Excellent book, Chuck. Thank you very much to both of you. God bless you. To our listeners, thank you for joining. Special thanks to Mark Teresi, co-host, to also Michael May and Clinton Control for the great work they've done. God bless all of you who continue. We've just started our Easter season.